Hello, Michael Veach here, and welcome to another Yarra Valley Writers Festival Sunday session. And today we take a long look at the short story in Why Short Stories Have a Big Impact. Our writers today are Sean O'Byrne, author of A Couple of Things Before the End. Alice Bishop's collection of stories on the Black Saturday fires, A Constant Hum, has just won her the Herald Sun Young Novelist of the Year award. The same award won by our third author, Josephine Rowe, author of Here Until August. Hosted today by Alice Cottrell from the Australian literary magazine Kill Your Darlings. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome to everyone watching at home, joining us for Why Short Stories Have a Big Impact. My name's Alice, I'm the publisher at Kill Your Darlings magazine, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this session today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the various lands on which we might be meeting. I'm currently on the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future, as well as pay my respects to elders from any other communities who might be watching today. And I'm also very pleased to introduce Alice Bishop, the author of A Constant Hum, Sean O'Byrne, the author of A Couple of Things Before the End, and Josephine Rowe, the author of Here Until August, amongst other things. Hello all.
Hi.
So we thought we'd start with a few short readings from each of the writers. I think it's really nice just to get a kind of flavour of the work and to hear the writers read their own work. So if we can start with you, Alice, that would be great.
Sure. So I decided to read Flight Path today with a little bit of a message to Josephine, and I chose it because of it's about horses, and I love horses, and the story is based in my own very limited experience of being a strapper, which lasted for about 2 days. So yeah, it's called Flight Path. Those morning horses, they're floating. Aluminium shoes glinting in Ron's makeshift track light. Small Hania Reese, she's leaning against the humming Ford Falcon, its training float looming behind her with paint cracked like her mum's hard-boiled eggshells. Always lacing the bench, the bluestone kitchen tiles, the sink. The girl's fingers are rosy from Yarra Glen fog. Trainer Ron's nose, it's always that way. For months now of whiskey-warmed evenings, spent alongside Channel 9, turned down low for company. Go on, the woolen-fingered, leather-booted men call from crusty trackside, hands tensing around scratched-up flasks of Nescafe. Pull her up, use the whip, or get some cool-down fleeces unfolded, young hands, quick sticks. Hills of fire-stripped trees surround the track. Twists of limb and charcoal trunks, they glow, silhouetted by the climbing sun. Like their mounts in blinkers, though, those riders keep their eyes on the track. Skinny limbs padded with Woolworths flannel and fleece. Ron's newest filly, Kodak Moment, has been put out to watch today, her bulky head strapped down by PVC martingale, by rusting snaffle. Her legs are bound tight from recent falls. Want her to win big in the nursery race, this one, Ron says to Hania. Hania, though, she hasn't learned to always smile. She nods. Valley ibis are already up, picking the turf for track workers' breakfast scraps, crumb-lined microwavable pasty packets, crusts of the bakery's first bread, and staling Vegemite sandwiches made in bulk. Nights before. Then the earliest Mackenzie school bus, still empty, sails by in the trackside fog, making the young filly, galloping long, shy wide. Get her listening, push her, the turn, Ron calls over icy track, his voice scattering clouds of birds from the railings, from the tops of parked falcons, one-tonners, and regoless trailers. Young Hania is startled too. Her quickening breath blows morning fog like smoke while watching Kodak's ears, not flickering to listen, but flattening further with something like determination. The horse's head lowers as its body stretches, long, picking up speed. A strapper, unawares, somewhere calls coffee orders. Jack, Pinger, Bruce. All the horses in the filly's path disperse, dancing, before getting pulled up by rain, by flash band. Then both track-bound horses and riders recognize the faint crackle in Ron's voice. Pull her up now, shit. The high-pitched hum that comes with contained breath and tightening chest. Truck brakes squeal at a nearby intersection, and Hania begins to feel that heady thrum, the sign of things to come. The ridge above, stripped, blackened, shadows the fall. Cows in neighbouring paddocks turn their heads slowly towards the impending crack of bone and of barrier. Hania doesn't look up at the running of riders or at that roan filly, Kodak, landed on her back. She tries to get up but is stuck, the horse, like a jam-jarred slater or an overturned silverfish, squirming amid reeling jockey, amid all that tack. And that's it.
That was lovely. Thank you,
Thanks.
Alice. Josephine, can I ask you to read next?
Sure. I love that story, Alice. We can talk a little bit more about my familiarity with it later. I thought I would read from a story called Chavez, which is the longest story in Here Until August. And it feels kind of right for the moment. It's about a woman who, for reasons we come to understand in the course of the story, is afraid to leave her apartment until she takes on the care of a neighbor's dog, and he necessarily gets her out into the world. I'll read a couple of excerpts maybe. Before Chavez, I would make micro promises to myself, micro rewards I could receive if only I would leave the building. Fresh cigarettes, nice underwear, dark chocolate. I even wrote these items onto a list. Then I looked at my list. Was this World War II, with grandmother drawing coal lines up the backs of her legs and thickening the soup with a handful of mealie, etc., etc.? I made a better list. I added to it soft cheese, decent calvados if it could be found here, one very brave lipstick, red as Rosa Luxemburg, mangoes, pomelos, anything you want, I told myself, because money is not the problem. It is not money or worry for the lack of money that has been keeping me from such things, only the process of getting to them. If I look at my account balance, I will see that it is still loaded with all those insurance euros, not an act of God, apparently, of anyone's God. In the city so recently known as home, Lottie has leased my apartment to a couple of architecture students from Norway, and their euros, too, pile up into my account. I am an imposter here, in this rabbity warren with its poor Marias, hiding behind a stranger's furniture with a different stranger's dog. I simply arrived in the city and, like Chavez, curled into the smallest space I could find. And there is for sometimes days, for sometimes whole weeks, no good thing I can dream up that will convince me to scurry out from it. No color of lipstick, no amount of fine stuff. Disaster does not choose people. I try to console myself with this thought. Somebody must be standing on the bridge when it collapses, riding the plane when it goes down. Disaster does not care to seek us out. It simply is, and we are, and we meet along some terrible axis we are too small and too stupid to understand. I know, at the center of my logical self, that this is true. But at night, it is not enough only to pull the curtains. I must also turn off all the lights and disconnect all the twinkling appliances and move around in the darkest dark so that nobody outside can know by my shadow exactly where I am or what I am doing. Even if what I am doing is only making tea or giving water to the sick monstera plant. Once in bed, I curl up into a ball, very tiny. So if someone were to enter my room, I might be the last thing they would notice. I can get by on very little. All during my adult life, I have been proud of this fact. I do not mean only food. A handful of sleep and a few pages of something. Black coffee and an eavesdropped conversation with a woman who claims to read the auras of birds. This is sufficient. But what I was down to, what almost forced me out into the daylight, was the fact that the only non-condiment items on my cupboard shelves were 1 jar of maraschino cherries and 1 half bag of rice. And a jar of cherries is really perched on the condiment, non-condiment divide. And in the end, I decided I could last 2 days on that, perhaps 3, because there was still coffee, if half stale, and also various spices to enliven the rice. And if one day I permitted myself a cigarette instead of lunch, but Chavez demands to go out. And so it happens that I see my building from the outside for the first time in a week, and I am surprised to find it beautiful. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. That was lovely. And last but by no means least, Sean.
This is from a story called Missy, and it's some attempt at an idea of what things might be like, say, in 10 or 15 or 20 or however long it's going to be when the weather gets quite bad, really very bad in everywhere, and especially in the city. And the only other thing to say is the story is told in emails. So these are just a few emails from one lady trying to get something for herself and her family. All right, so from Missy. This is the first email. Dearest George, just checking in to say hi. The heat is really getting us down here. There's not much to say. I wish I had some news for you. Roger Seddon sent David a thing about new technologies and decarbon bots, and David is very excited about that. I understand from the very helpful Fiona in your office that you do get, it sounds like, hundreds of inquiries every day, but if you possibly can in the next few weeks, do let us know if there is any news about Highfern. We are so anxious to join you there. Jen. And then a few days later, after several more emails. Dearest Georgia, this is to apologise for emails I sent to you. I sent you 2 emails earlier today, one about an hour ago and another one about half an hour ago before that night. I do apologise. If you see them, please do disregard both of them. I've been a bit upset today because we had some trouble with the energy police. They were mean to Dad. And I found out a very, very old friend of mine, Susan Petherall, her husband John has got them into some very bad trouble. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm very worried for her and angry at him. It's his fault, John. I never liked him, the fool, always big-noting himself. He still has a private car, for God's sake, but they got an evac from their bit of Albert Park, which they knew was coming. It's the south. They're practically on the waterfront. And they got approval for Sienna at Bonnie Doon, which I know you would know is a very, very good reserve. But then it's a month and he still won't go. And I said to her, you've got to go. And she said, oh, John doesn't want to yet. Then they get their red evac. And so finally he gets in that bloody car and says he wants to take Morgan. He's their King Charles Spaniel, which was not the plan. Morgan was supposed to go to Alistair's, their son. But John thinks you can just change an evac order. The Ennies won't stop him because he's John Petherall. Well, of course they stopped him. Of course they stopped a private car. They stopped them at Craigieburn, took one look at the back seat, and there under a tartan rug was Morgan. And John and Sue had to come back to Melbourne to a public reserve. Sue was texting me, but now no more from her. I texted Alistair and he doesn't know. I'm sorry to have sent wrong emails to. I'm very sorry. I was just upset. I think because I think Sue could get sick in a public, that idiot commissioner says now he has to say, after all the nonsense, there is cholera in them. They say you don't get one bit of water without queuing for God knows how long. And those crowds in the heat, I'm not good in big crowds. I get very anxious, and then with that it would be quite impossible. But I apologise for those earlier emails. I understand that many people must be putting lots of pressure on you up there, and I have to be brave. David doesn't help me. Yours with an apology, Jen. Another email. Dear George, thinking about our application, I was wondering whether the presence of our dog Missy was a problem and whether I should have done more to explain why she was included. I understood from the application process and the documentation you sent that pets were allowed, provided each pet had a separate form and provided the family could prove, of course, it could meet the significant extra costs. And it was my understanding from conversations with Fiona that certainly the inclusion of a family pet was not a potential problem for the success of the overall family application. But I wonder now if at this time, when the general situation does seem so much more serious, whether it would be better to ask you if the inclusion of Missy in our application is creating problems, and if Highfern has a quota of small dogs it can take in any given admission period. She's my dog more than anyone else's, and I was the one who did want her to come with us, and it would be hard for me to withdraw her application, but I do see it was perhaps wrong to put her in. But when David was at Cause Group and the kids were gone, she really has been my friend for a lot of years. I have tried hard to keep her through all these times. I've worried about her so much in this heat. She's very adaptable and very good, and I do think the maintenance is adjustable, I find. I keep her top coat very short in these conditions, and even though there's less meat, of course, not even chuck or bones, she will have the sweet potato or the pumpkin now, and the soya every other day, which is not easy for an active little dog. She is a West Highland Terrier. But it all has been hard, and I know things are really changing now. Let me think it over. I do see it, but please let me think again and I'll write again soon. Yours, Jen.
Thanks so much, Sean, and to all of you. So a great diverse mix of stories there with very kind of distinct styles and tones. That's one of the things that I love about short stories, is the kind of breadth that you can have throughout the form and also in just one collection by itself. So what I was interested to ask you was where your love of short stories happened, if there's a kind of particular moment of reading or writing that you can pinpoint, when you first thought, this is what short stories can do. I'll start with you, Sean.
I think I was thinking about this because I've been asked this once or twice, and I was already coming up with explanations that I thought, perhaps if I thought about it more, it didn't turn out to be true. I wanted to say something about them being more than a novel, able to take in a vernacular language or recognise more of the way in which high culture is breaking down into something like, corporate commercial entertainment. But then as soon as I started talking like that, or later, I realised that the novel can do that every bit as much. Something like Ulysses or Dos Passos or David Foster Wallace can write. All those things and people wrote big novels that can take in plenty of different kinds of culture. So I think for me, it came out sort of from an odd side direction, which was taking in more sketch comedy when I was a boy and an adolescent than literature. I think that there weren't many books in my house, really any books in my house when I was a kid and a teenager. So I got a lot of sketch comedy and not much of what you would think of as literature. And it was only later when I sort of found literature for myself that I began to understand sort of what it was and how much I needed it. So, and this might be a sort of a strange answer, but it really was trying to then turn literature back towards sketch comedy rather than finding the form for itself, or getting to the short story through a strange mix of what I understand to be literature and sketch comedy.
Thanks, Sean. And Alice, what about you?
I think it's in year 11 we did Richard Ford's Rock Springs, and for me that was like a really big eye-opener to what the short form could do. Being on a panel with Josephine will cringe, but she was also, or has always been a huge, much of a favourite writer of mine, and picking up East of Here Close to Water in probably 2012 at North Fitzroy Library when I worked there. I was just really blown away by how short stories can capture so much in so efficiently, I think, but also you can pick them up again and see stuff that you didn't maybe see before. And I've also really always loved, country music, and I have been endlessly talking about John Prine, who's recently died, because I think he's a beautiful, simple storyteller that gets so much across in songs like his song Sam Stone. It's just these character studies of people that maybe wouldn't have been thought of as having stories to tell, but mostly, you know, those are the people that have the best stories. So yeah, I love short stories so much.
And Josephine, what about you?
I don't know if I have as clear an answer as the other two, as Alice and Sean. I'm not sure if I can point to a particular story writer who sparked my love for short forms. I guess I was writing stories from a pretty young age, since I was a child. I guess if a lot of people are in, you know, primary school and high school. I guess the difference being that I, at some point, realized maybe that was a way that you could actually spend your life by, you know, drawing the things around you into language. And also I have quite a frenetic mind. So writing for me is sort of a way of gaining some sort of clarity and helping to sort of articulate usually a question or something that's niggling at me for whatever reason. But I also sort of came to it more through poetry as well. And I think we get into trouble with those distinctions as well between what is, you know, where's the difference between a story and a novel. And sometimes the line between poetry and fiction can be as equally kind of porous. And I do find I gravitate more towards stories that have that kind of density to them and that distilled quality and the attention to detail and the sort of atmosphere and the atomizing of a situation that a poem can do. And as Sean said, with vernacular as well, the voices and the range of voices you can take on within the short form, and what a reader will stay with you for in that kind of pact where they you appreciate it might be 8 pages or 10 pages. So I feel like you can kind of take bigger risks in a way than you might with a novel. Again, I don't mean to make a sort of value judgment on one or the other, but I guess those are the things I appreciate about short stories.
It's very interesting that everyone chose an influence that isn't directly related to literature. So I've got songs, poetry, and sketch comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Josephine, just in relation to what you were saying about poetry, one of the things I love about your stories is kind of what's unsaid as well as what's said. And I think there's so much kind of space created in the stories. And that goes back to what Alice was saying, that you can go back multiple times. Could you speak a bit about how that works, what you decide to include or exclude?
I mean, it's always tricky. I do tend to... I love elliptical narratives. I love the sort of trust that shows in a writer, both of themselves and their conviction to their material, but also in their readers as well, and in the intelligence of their readers. Sean's is, I mean, both Alice and Sean do this beautifully. Sean's Missy that he just read, we're only getting one half of this conversation, and we're led into all of this sort of spiraling self-talk, and it's so sad and hard because you can see what this particular character is doing with silence and with not having everything told to her, and I think that's a testament to its power as well. I love all of Alice's collection, and Flight Path, which Alice read before. I read not knowing really much at all about Alice. I didn't know, much about her background or her connection to Black Saturday. I read this on the other side of the world doing a correspondence, facilitating a correspondence workshop. And I was just so blown away by the kind of that clip of the language. That particular story has this wonderful gallop to it that fits in with her subject matter, and it really sort of gets into the patterns of your reading when you're reading it. But you know, there's such a strength to the voice there, because she does sort of launch you right into that and the jargon, and you kind of are there in a very sensory, physical way, I think. And sometimes that requires not setting the scene in a traditional way.
Yeah, maybe you could speak a bit more on that, Alice. Some of the short stories in your collection are very short indeed. I think there's one that's only one sentence each, one sentence on its own. And I think some of them are, you know, all the more potent and powerful for that. I was just wondering sort of how you decide which stories are which length, or if that's just something that comes naturally in the writing process.
Yeah, I mean, some of them started much longer than they ended up. I think Flight Path, I cut back a fair bit. I think I love writers, as I've mentioned, Josephine, I love. And I think writers like Sandra Cisneros, who writes these beautiful page stories where you can see that so much work has gone into stripping it back to just, you know, the golden bones of it all, really, that you read and you just feel like you're there. I think it always kind of, probably like for Sean and Josephine, for me, it always comes from a nugget of experience, or a flash of something that I've seen where I really want to capture that moment. That story for me was yeah, from my own horse had bucked me off when I was like 14, and this let's call him a gentleman who was from the racetrack. He was probably 80, had worked there, and he offered me a job when he picked me up off the side of the road with no horse. And I was just thinking a lot about that whole community and ecosystem that I'd never known existed, and that that's the great thing about short stories, is you can kind of just be dropped somewhere and learn so much about people's, you know, loves and longings and hardships and stories, without feeling like you're, as Josephine said, you kind of you're trusting the reader, and you're kind of, you're not diminishing them in any way. You're saying, this is who I am and here I am. And I think that's a really that's something I really love about short fiction and short stories and novels too, if they do it well. So yeah.
And Sean, for you, what about that kind of space in the stories? How do you navigate how much to tell or how little?
At some point or another, when I was trying to make the stories, I realized that one thing I'm not good at, which rereading Alice's and Josephine's book, I was struck by how good they are at this, which is that sort of metaphorical intelligence, where you see an object as another object, and the way you make it, you can bring it to somebody's attention or show it to them in a new way, make it beautiful or make it ugly. You say, haven't you ever noticed that this looks like that? Or haven't you noticed that this is that in some way? My whole life, I've never walked around the world and thought, oh, it's X is Y. I don't have that. I just don't make that sort of sense. But what I was always interested in, and what I do have some sort of, I'm always paying attention to, is the way people present their self, the way people try and control or present their personality. I think because I grew up with people who weren't like me. I mean, maybe every writer grows up with people who aren't like them, but the way it happened to happen for me was, I think from very, very early on, I was just looking at the way people perform themselves and understanding in some way that I couldn't do it the same way as them. And then through comedy, and also through when I was trying to be an actor, I got stuck, or at least interestedly stuck, more and more in voice. So when it was time to try and make the stories, when I was trying to make the stories, sooner or later I worked out that I shouldn't try and present what could be thought of as a full fiction, a narrative voice that would present all of what was able to be experienced in whatever the field was. I thought I'll narrow it to the voice. And it did solve the problem of me not being good at something. I could concentrate on a kind of mimicry and not have to go out all the time and think, well, what am I going to say about the weather? Or how am I going to say to somebody that vase could be something else or is something else in that moment? Again, not really having much of a going along sense of that. And once I got to that, that became an interesting problem all of its own, which is, well, what can you just tell through voice? And how do you make sure you're telling enough through voice? Because you still have to smuggle in enough of the circumstances. You still have to smuggle enough of, well, where is this person and you know, what's the drama? Like, what's going on enough that would make this enough to pay attention to? And then I could go on and see that there was enough of a tradition through literature of people doing that voice telling, all the way up from, say, Twain to Salinger, through to somebody like David Foster Wallace. There's such a Jane, also going back the other way, back to Jane Bowles or Lydia Davis. There are so many people who are so good at this, at just, narrowing a story enough to just what a voice can tell, and then coming up with lots of little different ways you can also, I don't know, slyly enough include in enough of where this person is and what they want, what's bothering them, what they need.
Yeah, and a lot of the stories in your collection, people are kind of filtering through different means, emails or internet comment message boards or a transcript. So I guess you kind of felt that those forms could free you to do things that the traditional form couldn't do. I was curious about if you experimented with the forms kind of when you're writing a story. Was it a chicken or the egg? Did the form or the content come first, as it were?
Yeah. As you said that, I mean, you say these things and they might be true. As you said what you said just then, it occurred to me, right, so was it because I was already narrowed to the voice that it did set me up to pay attention more to those forms of commentary? There's so much voice around now, right? And the ways in which voice is delivered far too hastily, far too quickly, without really much testing, or whether, much sense of whether this person really gets to participate or not. So maybe it was just a piece of luck that I was already thinking or stuck in voice, and then I just, then it wasn't so far to just notice how many bits and pieces of voice there are now around us. It's sort of one of our biggest problems.
So, Alice, I wanted to talk about how you talk about landscape in your book, because I just feel like landscape is so present throughout, and you're able to build such a picture of a particular landscape to us just in a few short words. I was just wondering if landscape was something that you were really focusing on in the writing process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I set out to focus on landscape, but it kind of, I wrote a constant hum through, I probably started when I was maybe 24, and I'm almost 34 now. And I think there was, our house burnt down on Black Saturday in 2009, just before I started my master's in creative writing. And it was, I did a course with Tony Birch called Genealogies of Place, and that kind of class really introduced me to the fact that it was kind of okay to really focus on landscape as almost a character, and landscape as a changing thing that can reflect, how you're feeling, and vice versa. And a lot of people have said, that the kind of, it's landscape poetry, and that's really interesting. And I think that that's really cool, but it's not anything that I ever necessarily set out to do in the beginning. But I guess maybe there's kind of roots in loving, books like Richard Ford's Rock Springs, which was all about, Montana, and loving horse books as a kid, and Daggy books like The Saddle Club, where it's kind of still about place, even though it's not, great literature, but it's all set in a place. And for me, I really longed for a place that had disappeared, and really wanted to both record the bush before the bushfires and record the bush those 10 years after Black Saturday, where I felt both really lucky that I was seeing this kind of, once in a lifetime regrowth and the energy of that. but I also wanted to record how I really felt a physical grief for the place I knew as home. So that's probably why there is a lot of landscape in A Constant Hum, but I love writing about landscape, and yeah, I think I kind of gravitate towards that anyway. Yeah.
And what was that process like, writing about kind of source material that is so close to your experience, and also like a very traumatic experience for lots of other people that you would know as well?
Yeah. I don't know if my school of thought is I also almost assume that everyone's writing about their own lives in some sense. And when I'm reading writers, when I'm reading Deborah Levy or Josephine Rowe, I find I do gravitate more to writers where I feel like you can sense it's part that, it's not necessarily like there are different characters, but there is an essence of truth in some experience. And for me, I wrote a lot of ordinary stories straight after the fires, because I think it was too charged with emotion and sadness and fear. And then I think the further I got away and I could look at it from a bit more of a clearer vantage point, I was able to introduce narratives that weren't my own, weren't my own. So that really fleshed out my writing, I think, and also to be able to write emotions that I felt, I'm sure as Sean and Josephine do, through other characters, was a really exciting and wonderful thing, and wonderful to think about those other splintered perspectives as well.
Just in reference to that kind of growth or change in your writing, I was curious to ask Josephine, you published a novel a few years ago, and I wondered if after writing a novel your attitude to short story changed, or it changed the way that you worked.
Well, the novel actually was one of the first stories for this collection, or it was meant to be. So Here Until August started out as a collection of short stories that were somehow grounded in place-based mythologies and urban legends, or just, sites that had kind of some meaning, some storied meaning in a shared cultural sense. And this particular story, which definitely had as Alice was saying, the kind of the emotional truth of the story was closest to biography, autobiography, and it just developed and ate the rest of it became a novella, and then it sort of, it was more work to try and contain it in a way. And I was very lucky to be at Stanford on the Stegner Fellowship for a couple of years, and had Tobias Wolff as a facilitator for that novel, especially, which has a lot to do with the aftermath of the Vietnam War. I was very daunted, but also very grateful to kind of have his thoughts on that then novella. And he said, you're only kind of hurting it by trying to keep it this lean. You need to sort of let it out. And the thing is, I don't think my approach changes all that much at a sentence level. So my writing process is pretty chaotic, and I go through so many drafts and so many very minor variations of the same sentence. Anybody looking over my shoulder would think that I was crazy, and maybe I am a little bit, but that's the only way I know of working. And I kind of I think there's part of me that enjoys that kind of fastidiousness as well. So I wonder with the novel, as Alice said, that sort of connection to place came into it because I was writing it from Montreal and from California, and so Australia had this very kind of crystalline, I don't think it's a very nostalgic novel, so hopefully that didn't color it too much, but there was a very vivid, there's a vividness that comes in when you're away from everything that you know best. And so there was that. And I've lost my train of thought. Where was I going? By virtue of being in one place for 2 years, which is about as long as I've been anywhere in my adult life, I think, there's a reason we think of, we think of the great short story writers like Carver and Lucia Berlin, and they were very peripatetic people. They moved around a lot, and also money was an issue. So they were kind of, I think being in one place certainly helps a story develop, especially if you are the kind of person who writes on paper and typewriter, and there's just that practical element of being able to sort of get into that daily routine to let a story develop that way strikes me so far as a sort of major difference between how they come about.
And some of the places that you just mentioned, Montreal and others, are included in stories in Here Until August. Yeah. And I read somewhere, I can't remember where, that you kind of shaped the collection in terms of seasons around the world. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think often working out how to arrange a collection, there's a degree of arbitrariness there because you overthink it, but part of you knows that most people will read story collections the way you read a story collection, which is to sort of go in, see what titles speak to you at that time, or how long are how many pages are they and how much time do you have. But I definitely thought a lot about seasons over the past 7 years, kind of moving between the North and the Southern Hemisphere. And of course, the way that, say, a Montreal winter impacts upon a psyche, or the psyche of a relationship in the case of the story, whether or not, to whatever extent we're aware of how we're shaped by seasons, we definitely are. And I think as when we were talking about Alice's collection, I don't think you can help but be more in tune with that if you live in a place like Christmas Hills. I think we're bulwarked a little bit in cities from appreciating what the weather and the landscape do to us. But by nature of, or by virtue of necessity, I think you pay more attention to it if you live in a rural area.
And Alice, A Constant Hum is split up into 3 sections.
Yes.
Prevailing, southerly, northerly. Could you explain sort of how that came about and how you shaped the collection, how you draw?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because it was my first book. I didn't really think, and I was so focused on the short story, I didn't realize that you had to think of an overall structure of the stories, and that's where having a good editor kind of came in for me, in that I kind of get a bit bogged down in the smaller details, and like in my life, I do that as well, and sometimes forget about the bigger picture. So my editor, David Winter, who's brilliant at text, he sent me back the manuscript and said, you need to have, I think we should break this into 3 parts so it gives it some trajectory. I wanted to start with the bushfires. So the collection spans 10 years. I wanted to start with Black Saturday and then slowly go out to the 10 years following. But he said, no, let's, obviously it's your choice, but it would be better if it was a build up to starting from like where we are today to the fires. And he said, you know, it'd be really good to bunch the stories up into those time spans and to have 3 chapters. And first of all, I thought that it would be really good to have it with fire warnings, so code red, obviously the last chapter. But I think that was a bit ham-fisted, and I went back to my parents' house in their rebuilt house in Christmas Hills, and I was having dinner with them, and my beautiful mum was like, "Oh, what about wind patterns?" And I just knew straight away that it was the way it had to be. So it starts with prevailing, so it's like the kind of the wind as it stands, builds up to southerly, which is a cooler wind, and then to northerly. And I think that also tied back into the fact that on Black Saturday, the East Kilmore fire that burnt down our road went over our house, went down into Stills Creek, and then the wind changed and it came back up over our house again. And I think that was a really big thing for people who lived through Black Saturday, or even probably the recent fires. Winds take on a much a different meaning in that people lost lives because of wind patterns, and a northerly now brings up a lot of different things for people. Rather than just that kind of hot city oven door heat, it can be the thing that took so much away from so many people. So I thought that was both poetic and telling, I guess. So
yeah, and it does really give you a feeling as the reader, for me at least, of this kind of shift in the collection, that you're going somewhere new, which I loved.
Thank you.
Sean, what about you? What was the experience of ordering your collection like, or, you know, choosing how things would fit together?
Yeah, that's so interesting about the organisation of A Constant Hum. And I wanted to do something which was starting out from what could be thought of as maybe my problems with my people, and then trying to both express an amount of separation and alienation and anger and comic anger at them. But then as the stories went along, try and bend that over down into some sense of the bigger problem that's coming towards us. That Missy story started when I was out in Kew one day, and I was house minding out in Kew, and I grew up much further out, but I was really struck in Kew. These 2 men were exercising their dog, and one man said to the other man about the dog, "Oh, he only drinks running water." And I remember thinking, it took me a moment to understand what he meant, which means if you put a bowl out in front of the dog won't drink still water. And it was one of the few times I had a sense of sort of something like there could be a story or an amount of sort of need to say something right away. I thought I did have that sudden sense of what is going to happen? What is going to happen out here when you get an amount of, like, for God's sake, the dog won't take a bowl of water. If we're running it this way, what's going to happen? And that sense too that, you know, in my own way, I would be running it that way. I would have a bunch of things. If they were taken off me in a couple of weeks, I would barely know what to do. We're so not ready for the amounts of serious privation that could be coming towards us. So the job of the book, as much as I could do it, was to start to take more and more people, both from maybe my family or people around where I grew up, and then all the way through to people like me now, and sort of in the middle of the middle class, and then into the upper middle classes. And just imagine as many people as I could coming up to something where the city is not the city in the way that we know it is now, and the weather is not the weather in the way we know it is now. And the sort of thing that Alice describes so extraordinarily well in her book becomes something that is, as we've begun to see, something that happens horribly, frighteningly often.
Yeah, I think the short story form is one that's kind of very well suited to speculative fiction or satire, both of which you do in your collection. Would you agree on that? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I think so, and I, in a half confused way, I think it goes back to that sketch comedy idea. I think this might not be true, but it's just that satire seems to have a sort of shorter lifespan. Like once you're introduced to the idea and you're given a certain amount of development or performance of that idea, that's usually enough for people. I mean, it might not be true. There's sometimes a satiric idea that you really could spread over several hundred pages, but I did have the sense through the book of, once I'd introduced my little amount and hopefully work to justify it, it was time to get going. It's time to try something else. And that would maybe have something to do with the difference between a narrative and something that's a narrative and, in some sense, an attack or a joke. There's only so long you can hear a joke, and there's only so long you can put up with an attack. Hopefully with the idea, too, that the attack is also turning into something that's not just an attack on people, but that thing that is more literature than sketch comedy, which is a recognition that the person you started out attacking is somebody like you, and you're more like them than you wanted to admit. And that's sort of hopefully what you kind of learn by trying for a fiction.
And how important are titles? Because the final story in your collection, I think it's the final story called Bunker. Mm-hmm. I just think the title is so great because it does so much work in terms of how you understand the story. I just wondered if titling stories, when that happens, when you make those decisions.
Sometimes I would know all the time, and sometimes I would have to have a little fight with myself. That does remind me of something that Lydia Davis said, though, which is, if your stories are very short, the title has to do some narrative work. So, sometimes I would get away with the difficulty of explaining exactly where we were and exactly what was happening. Well, if I pushed it into the title, all right, that would get some of it done there. Because that Bunker story, because it was the very last story and I wanted it to be the saddest, and in a way the idea of that story was almost as if it was all coming from somewhere where it was very dark and you couldn't see or hear much. So the idea that it was just that I could get the idea that you were down in the bunker into that first title, and then have those lines of that person trapped down there say those things one after the other. Yeah. So sometimes the title is a way to start the story before it even starts.
What about you, Josephine? How do you choose your titles?
Sorry, I'm still a step back in Bunker. I read that story a few months ago when Sean's collection first came out, and then I tried to read it today, Sean, and I just, it is so it was crushing the first time round, and you kind of marveled at the humanity of it as well. I think there's a great sensitivity in both Alice's and Sean's writing. But in Bunker, reading that now, I don't want to spoil anything for listeners, but it didn't feel 10 or 20 years away. It felt so close, and so did Missy, that it was almost too much. As far as how important titles are, vary, and sometimes they're the most difficult thing because they are by their nature instructive, or can sometimes be, I suppose, deflect. Often for me, it's either the first thing to come or the last thing, and more often it's the last thing. Here Until August had a different working title for several years that I liked very much.
I loved that title too. I love them both, but Horse Latitudes is just beautiful.
It's really good. Because it's good, it's already been taken. And someone got in before me, which is fine.
Was that why? Just because somebody else had it?
Due diligence. I did kind of, you go a few pages deep into Google and see if anybody else has a work of fiction under the title that you want your book to be. And at the time there wasn't, and then shortly before my book was published, there was. So I sort of had 2 weeks to come up with a new title. I won't go through the kind of spiraling and the almost titles, because
Here Until August is a beautiful title. And
it's beautiful.
Beautiful.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Here Until August is a beautiful title, and the poem that phrase comes from is very beautiful.
Yeah.
Yes, why am I talking about myself when I could be talking about Louise Gluck? It didn't come from Louise Gluck. It came to me in the shower, where all good things find you. And going back to what you asked about seasons, actually, Alice. So when I was thinking about epigraphs for Here Until August, I wanted to give a sense of that, August being a kind of a very potent month and a very decisive month, regardless of where you are in the world. There is that sort of long, heartbreaking, late light of the northern August, and it's coming into harvest time, and there's this sort of feeling of winding off, and then here in Melbourne, at least, it's still very chilly, but there's the sort of it is also a turning point, and you get to see the jasmine just coming in, and you feel things start to kind of it doesn't snow here, but you feel a thawing and a sort of unfurling. And I wanted to get to initially epigraphs that would give a sense of the dichotomy, I guess, of August. And a friend directed me to a poem by Louise Gluck. It's actually called October, but there's a beautiful line in that. I know what I see, sun that could be the August sun, returning everything that was taken away. And then I didn't want a second poem. I thought, that spoke enough for, regardless of where you were in the world.
And lots of the characters in the stories in the collection do have these kind of big turning points. And one of the things I love about the way you write is this kind of expansive sense of time in short stories. The character can simultaneously be in the present, thinking about the past, letting you know what's going to happen in the future. I was just wondering how you kind of approach that from like a craft perspective, I guess, getting that dimension of time into quite a short period.
Yeah, I think it's quite natural to the way that I build stories, and I think it's quite natural to life and how we experience things, which is why language, and Sean mentioned objects, everything's entirely subjective, and we might think we're experiencing the same thing, but our histories give us different lenses. As to how you make that navigable for a reader is sort of the more difficult question, or sort of bring them into that often quite shifting or fluid sense of time. And I think that just comes from me, at least, a lot of editing and going through 20, 30 versions of a 5,000 word story, and reading aloud as well. And you kind of hear then, I would recommend reading your work aloud, regardless of what particular trait you're looking at, but you can definitely hear when things become more confusing or tense shifts don't work. Yeah.
Thanks, Josephine. So I think we're running out of time, and at this point, if we had a live audience, then I might be able to ask for some questions. So I thought instead maybe I'd ask if you guys had any questions for each other.
Woo!
I have one question that I was just thinking about. Do you mind if I go first?
No.
Okay. So I loved, and it's not about short stories, I apologize, but I loved A Loving Faithful Animal, Josephine. And for me, when you're talking about going from, back historically and back to like almost flashback seems like too small a word to kind of encapsulate everything. But when you were writing A Loving Faithful Animal, did you write it in smaller parts and then sew them together, or did you write them? Did you write the book kind of knowing your plot points and what you wanted to hit, or yeah?
So before I mentioned that the initial, I guess the nucleus of it was for the short story collection and the sort of geographical mythology for it was the Phantom Panther in rural Victoria. And for me, that story has always been sort of enmeshed with the tattoo my father has of a panther on his arm, which was the mascot at the Puckapunyal barracks.
Wow.
They actually had a panther there because, you know, somebody had brought it back from Sumatra or something like that. So of course, you know, it seemed logical to me that that this Phantom Panther could have just escaped from the army barracks. So it kind of started there, and then in terms of the concerns of the novel about the emotional aftermath of war and conscription, it just telling that story through the perspective of a 13-year-old girl just seemed quite limited in a way I didn't want. It seemed fair to sort of give everybody's sort of side of the story, including the war veteran father, who is maybe the more difficult character to empathize with, but that was, for many reasons, that was very important to me in the going. But yeah, it was very fragmentary for a while, and I guess still has some of that element in it by design. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Josephine or Sean, any questions?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Might I please ask Alice and Josephine? And then this might not be something that can happen right now, but can you think of examples of where, like, you were reading someone, or there's a writer that you've relied on that really quite sort of pretty directly taught you something, that you could see the way that they were solving a formal problem or opening up a formal possibility? I'm always interested in I'm interested to know, and you never get to ask, so thank you, Alice, for letting us ask. You never get to ask writers, like, who taught you, you know, who did you rely on sometimes to just stop you doing what you were doing and understand that you could do something differently?
Josephine for me.
Wow.
I feel like
Truly.
Wow. When you first read her first collection?
No. Yeah. Oh, yeah. When I picked up here, close to here. Oh my God, east of here.
This
close
tiny
to
book that nobody else is ever going to see because there were like 500 copies.
Yeah.
And what if you can? What was it in particular?
I just think,
like sheer lyrical ability.
Oh, just the small moments of everyday life that could be, I think, as you mentioned earlier, that could be turned into bigger stories, and just being a little bit more playful with length and form, and just for me, it was like really lit up a bad year of my life where I was like, oh, short stories can really, really make you see the world in a very different way. So yeah.
I love knowing that.
Sorry, Josephine.
Oh, it's lovely. Sean, I love this question. I love having a clear answer to something ready to go. I'm like, oh yes, I know this one. Usually, you know, people ask you who your favorite short story writers are, and it's like you've never read a short story in your life. You can't pull up anything. But wait, I can go to my bookshelf and show you exactly the book that's made such an impact on me. I'm sorry I'm off screen.
That's all right. This means we're waiting.
We're going to turn this question back on you, Sean.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, somehow oh no, wait.
Is it the Karawang? Is the Karawang there?
Well, we're waiting.
Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Absconding. I can't find my very dog-eared copy of Michael Ondaatje's Coming Through Slaughter, but that is the book for me.
Okay.
You can, you know, he does the, you know, that thing where he takes a hand historical facts and then just builds this incredible world about a trombone player or cornet player in New Orleans at the turn of last century. But the fragmentary style, and again, this is somebody who works across different forms and genres and blends them. And just this idea that, oh, you can start a novel with dolphin sonar. You can, I think ever since that, I've really gravitated towards narratives that sort of have that wild, associative kind of egalitarian approach as well to sort of how you use form, and that everything is there to sort of, some stories just require a different mode of telling. I mean, and in terms of form, Sean, yours probably show that best of the three of us, how you can kind of come through different modes of communication and different technologies and still have so much heart and depth in them. But I feel this is a question that you have a good answer to.
I sort of maybe hastily say, I think Lydia Davis, because she showed me how much in a more conventional narrative you could do away with, that you didn't have to rely on certain kinds of beginnings, middles and ends, but also that, and this really came through really strongly, say from my early, childhood, adolescence and young personhood, that you could make incompetence the subject, that you could make a certain idea, like just a real thoroughgoing confession about deep human incompetence, like really, sort of cognitive incompetence, not just somebody being funny, fall down way, but just the ways in which it's so hard for us to remember what we want, what we don't want, to control of ourselves in some really profound way. Her stories found formal ways to reenact that I was I was so drawn to.
Being made uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, and just the demonstration. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like a little flag up for fiction. A non-fiction could do it, but only a fiction really can just show you a personality haltingly trying to arrange itself that way. Like fiction really demonstrates the difficulty of keeping a personality running, as you go along.
Yeah.
It's sort of almost fiction's best card to play, right?
Can
I think we have to wrap up there, Josephine. I'm sorry. I wish we could talk all day. This has been really fascinating and enlightening. So thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone who's been joining us from home. And I would really advise you to grab yourself a copy of one of these 3 books if you haven't already.
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you,
Josephine.
Alice.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye, Sean.
Thank you, Josephine.
What a fascinating discussion there. Why short stories have a big impact. I can see we all have a lot of short story reading ahead of us. Next week we'll have another Yarra Valley Writers Festival Sunday session where I will be in discussion with the Birdman himself, Sean Dooley, editor of BirdLife, author of also The Big Twitch, what I think is one of the finest books about birds and Australia that's ever been written. Can't wait for that. Charcoal Sketches is the name of the discussion. Next Sunday, do join us. Thank you.